All righty. Welcome, everybody. We are interviewing Hebrew professors, and this is one of my professors, Dr. Matt Akers. And we are talking about Hebrew pedagogy, Hebrew learning, and how not all of us are very good at Hebrew still to this day. This guy. But Dr. Akers is definitely very good at it. And so, Matt, go ahead and tell us who you are and what you're doing currently.
Well, my name is Matt Akers, and I serve at Mid-America Baptist Theological Seminary. Actually, just completed 15 years. And
Woo!
these days, yeah, so just celebrated in May. So very excited
Nice.
about that. And I'm serving as the chair of the Old Testament department, as well as the director of the Old Testament, and as well, what I mean is also the director of doctoral studies and the Hispanic Institute, and just some odds and ends past that.
You need more heads for that many hats.
Well, I don't have a lot of hair, so I need to wear a hat. Otherwise,
Oh,
I get sunburned.
that's a very easy point. So you took over after Dr. Miller at Mid-America for the PhD dean, yeah?
That's right. He is
Yeah.
now serving as a professor emeritus, and so he's still teaching several classes. But when he became a professor emeritus, they put me in the positions that he originally was in, and so he is a great guy. He's one of the men who taught me Hebrew, and so I
Yeah.
really appreciate him.
Well, let's talk about that. So, was it Dr. Miller? So, what was your first exposure to Hebrew, and then who taught you principally?
My first exposure was Dr. Kirk Kilpatrick,
Okay.
who incidentally became my advisor. And so
Mm,
he taught me Hebrew 1 and 2.
mm,
And then after Hebrew 2, we used to have a class called Hebrew Exegesis, which was what Dr. Miller did. And in the program to go into the Old Testament and Hebrew doctoral program, you needed to have several Hebrew electives. And so I had an assorted number of electives from Dr. Kilpatrick and Dr. Miller.
mhm. Was was it Daniel? Did he do Daniel for master's level?
He did Daniel,
Okay.
and he does still teach Daniel from time to time. Wrote the
Mhm.
commentary for the
Yeah.
NAC series on Daniel.
Yeah.
And from Dr. Kilpatrick, I took a Job intensive in Hebrew, and he said, "Are you sure you want to do that?" And I
For
said,
real.
"Well, I need the hours." And he said, "Well, you're going to find it very interesting when you get into it." And he waited a little bit until I started, and I said, "This is really difficult." And he said, "This book has the most ancient Hebrew and the most obscure words you're going to find in the Old Testament."
Yeah.
And he also taught Middle Egyptian. That was one of his minors. He got at the University of Memphis. And so
Yep.
had a little bit of exposure to Middle Egyptian from him, which I was able to incorporate in the dissertation. So
Yeah.
both of them very talented linguists.
Um, did Dr. Miller do his doctorate work at Mid-America
He
and
did
Kilpatrick as well?
also, right.
So both of them inevitably had to have been students under Larry Walker then.
I believe so.
Yeah. Which, my profs at New Orleans in Hebrew were Larry Walker students from Mid-America back in the day. Um,
Right.
and then my profs at Union were students under Meredith Klein.
Okay.
So both of whom, Larry Walker and Meredith Klein, went to Dropsy College, I think is what it was called, which was a Orthodox Jewish seminary up in New York.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and it's now been subsumed by Boston College, I believe. But yeah, so it doesn't surprise me that Dr. Kilpatrick did Middle Egyptian, because Archie did Middle Egyptian, so did Jeff and other guys that I've studied with. And being in Memphis, it kind of makes sense since University of Memphis is there and they're good at it.
It is. Yeah, I taught at University of Memphis for 3 years. And so when I was working on my dissertation for the sections that were in Egyptian, they have an excellent Egyptian library. So it was right across from where I was teaching. So after class, I'd just go over there and walk around the library and see what resources they had. And they were very helpful to let me use everything on the
Yeah.
shelf.
Are you still able to handle any Middle Egyptian?
To an extent,
Yeah.
I asked Kilpatrick this once when I was learning. I said, "So are you fluent in this?" And he said, "There may be two or three fluent people in the world." He said, "Most
Yeah.
people, what they learn how to do is they learn the symbols and they increase their vocabulary, but they
Yeah.
learn how, the determinatives are used, and the triliteral roots and everything else, and all the symbols, what they mean." And he said, it's just something you got to keep working in. So I have the resources, and I could do it probably relatively slowly at, at some level, not
Yeah.
expert for sure.
Yeah, I know enough Middle Egyptian just to use the resources.
But yeah,
I mean, I appreciate our friends that are able to do it. But I don't have a need to read Middle Egyptian. So
right. Well, I have a theory that originally they probably had an alphabet and they just went to emojis, like many people do. And so what we're reading is actually the emoji stage of the Egyptian language.
have you
So,
found the poop emoji?
uh, well, there are some that definitely could fit that category.
Yes, there are. Egyptian is really interesting, and we can segue this into Hebrew. Because Middle Egyptian, from my recollection in conversations with Archie, is that Middle Egyptian is both pictographic and phonological. So you can have individual caricatures to be a word, but also they could count as a sound.
Right.
And I thought that was really interesting and unique. And Hebrew, at least the like Samaritan version and earlier, has sort of kind of the same type of thing going on. So what do you think the correlation is between Egyptian and early Hebrew, or Proto-Semitic Hebrew, as we might call it?
Well, that is an interesting question, since it's officially classified as a Hamido-Semitic language or
Mm-hmm.
Afro-Asiatic, depending on the terminology that you read
Mm-hmm.
in books, what they use. It does have a lot of African characteristics
Mm-hmm.
we would expect, and it does have a lot of characteristics of the Semitic languages as well. It's kind of a bridge, which would make sense where it's situated in the world.
Yep.
But also, what's interesting is that, because the Israelites were in Egypt for so long, that obviously would have affected the way that they spoke. And there are a lot
Yeah.
of loan words and other concepts that are in the language of Hebrew
Sure.
that are affected, just like anything that happens today. For example, when I was in the Philippines, I would hear people in Mitsayap that were speaking English, Spanish, and also Cebuano in the same sentences.
Mm-hmm.
I could hear some of the Spanish words. I'm like, well, I know where that's at. So that's very
Yep.
common, even today, where you have languages that are formed
Yeah.
that way. And so you can see that. And likely it was Semitic slaves who were working in Egypt that actually used hieroglyphs to create the first alphabet.
Okay.
And so you can see a definite relationship between hieroglyphs and Paleo Hebrew.
Yeah.
Obviously, you don't see that in the Aramaic script, but if you go back to
Right.
the Paleo Hebrew, you can see very, very um, interesting connections. You can make the connection to which hieroglyph they were likely
Yeah.
using.
Well, and I think if we go even more recent than Middle Egyptian, if we go to Hieractic Egyptian, which is late kingdom,
Right.
which is more the scriptic form of Egyptian, it has a lot more look-alike letters with our Paleo Hebrew, which makes sense because that would be the appropriate time period for our Israelite slaves to be in the land.
That's
Middle
right.
Egyptian is a little bit before Moses. That'd be probably Middle Egyptian is probably around the time period of Abraham, I would say.
Right. And the alphabet put the written language in the hands of everybody instead
Yeah.
of just being a special class of people. So it was really liberating in that sense.
Hmm. So whenever it comes to languages, what was the hardest thing for you to grasp when learning Hebrew?
When I was learning Hebrew, I think one of the most difficult things was just how compact the verbs were,
Mm-hmm.
because you can get a lot of information into those verbs, especially when you consider the stems. And
Mm-hmm.
when I was working in Hebrew and learned the 7 stems, I thought, wow, this is going to take some time to
Yeah.
learn. And that's one of the things I think that was most difficult for me. And then when I got into the specialized classes and when I was taking the intensives, and they said, oh, by the way, there are others like
Whole
L and all of these out there.
Yeah.
I said, I thought there were only 7. And they said, surprise, those are the most 7
The
common.
rug.
Right. The rug comes out and it's like, wait a minute. And there are quadriliteral roots sometimes. What are you telling me? And so, but I think it was mostly the verbal system. The most easy part was the definite article. As
Well,
you know, learn
yeah,
Greek, there are
yeah.
so many that you have to learn, and just Hebrew is ha, and so you tell the Greek students, ha ha, I've got it. So
Yes, yes. Now, whenever you say the verbal stems was the hardest part, are you referring to not just the seven strong stem changes, but also the synthetic factor that you can have the pronouns contract onto it, you can have the prepositions
right,
contract onto it? Yeah.
right. So it's learning how all of those things work together
Yeah,
and just how compact it can be. So
right.
learning the stems and then everything else that can affix to it.
Yeah, my first interview that we did on this series was with our linguistics professor at OBU, and she is a linguist formally. She did her doctorate in that, and we were talking about what family group does Hebrew fall under and why. And she said that it's under synthetic, and that's why a lot of English speakers struggle to learn Hebrew, is because they can jam everything onto one word,
Mm,
whereas if you unpack that or translate that back to English, it could be 7, 8 words.
right.
And our brains coming from English, which is a more complex language, to a simple language, we really struggle with that. Whereas some people that come from a simple to a simple, it's not as hard for them.
Yeah, it's not a Western language at all.
Right.
It's very, very different. So that's
Yeah.
just one of those things that makes it difficult for us to grasp.
Yeah. So let's not only is it hard to learn, but it's also hard to retain.
That's true.
So I think you and I were together at the Southwestern or the ETS Nationals whenever it was at San Antonio.
Right.
And Carl Sanders Jr. had presented a 5-year study where he studied from, I think it was 7 different seminaries, and said that he tested them for 5 years after graduating from seminary. And by the end of year 5, nobody could handle Hebrew.
Mm,
So and he basically kind of rounded it up and said that he would surmise that it's a 10% retention rate.
right.
Um, and of course that's been published and everybody's now talking about that. What do you think is the cause of a 10% retention rate? Pedagogy, practice, methodology, usefulness? What, there's all kinds of different things that different people have espoused. What do you think?
I think one thing is that we see in some schools a de-emphasis of the languages.
It's true.
And one of the reasons why is because they are hard.
Mm.
So sometimes people say, well, if you only have to study this much here, or you only have to do this here as opposed to this.
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes that's appealing to students. So I think that's one thing.
Mm.
And number two, I think it's when somebody gets out of seminary, sometimes they've been using those muscles, if I can use that analogy,
Mm-hmm.
that they don't continue to work out. And so I
Mm-hmm.
think it's important to set a goal to say that I'm going to do this much every week or every day. So one personal goal that I've had for years is I translate around 3 verses a day just to keep those muscles up. And so
Yeah.
typically what I do in January is I'll pick a book.
Right.
Sometimes it's a larger book, or sometimes I'll have some smaller books that I'll work on and have 2 or 3 during the year,
Mm-hmm.
and just translate 3 verses a day. And that keeps up the memory, that keeps me engaged. And so I think that's another thing that's important. People just don't engage those muscles. And sometimes it's easy also, I think, number 3, to take shortcuts.
Mm.
And we have a lot of wonderful resources out there, but sometimes we use the resources as a substitute for working personally in a language. And I guess you could say for number 4 would be busyness. There are some lazy people out there, but I don't know many in ministry.
Right.
I know many people who are very busy.
Right.
And so it just, really comes down to how people are going to use their time if they're already busy to begin with.
Sure.
And it's just important to keep those muscles up, because so much of the Old Testament is the foundation for the New Testament. And so many things in the New Testament can be understood much more clearly if we continue to use those Old Testament skills that we learn in Hebrew.
Yeah. So you also teach Greek, which is
I do. I haven't for a while. I
okay.
mean, but I do. I've taught for years and years Greek, but not recently.
Okay. So let's play this game in regards to Hebrew and Greek, Old Testament, New Testament. You and I've surmised this several times of different passages.
Mm-hmm.
Do you think that the and then statements in the Greek of Matthew can point us to the reality of Matthew originally being in Hebrew or Aramaic? Kind of like you have the Vayahis, the Vayahis, the Vayahis in the Old Testament Hebrew.
Yeah, perhaps. I mean, I think there are a lot of Hebraisms in
Yeah, oh
Matthew.
yeah.
So that
Oh
might
yeah.
be one of those carryovers. It just when you have an original language that you speak, that's really going to affect, to a large extent, the way that you speak in a second language or a third language, and the way that you structure things. And so I know a lot of bilingual people, and usually in their second language, you can hear certain things that they say that's based on the original language that they speak.
Right.
You might not hear in the population at large, So I'd say that's one of those factors that would tell us, yeah, you can see the Hebrew here.
Yeah, I'm really curious to see. Oh man, I just went blank. Professor at Southern, he's writing the new Pillar commentary on Matthew, because Pillar's updating, and he is Matthean priority and Hebrew Matthew in his thinking. So I'm kind of interested to see how he pulls that off, because I've felt that way. And we have St. Jerome saying he translated the Matthew from the original Hebrew into Latin, which I don't know that he really did, but that's what he says in his Vulgate, and that could be interesting. Sure. So daily reading and translating. Let's talk about this, because it has resulted in you now being a Bible translator and editor of a Bible translation. What?
Well, there's a translation going to be coming out in the next couple of years, new Tyndale version. Okay. And so 500-year anniversary of Tyndale and his translation efforts. And one of the professors at Mid-America who also teaches Hebrew, Dr. Van McLean, knew somebody who was working to put this translation together. And so he spoke to the Hebrew professors at Mid-America and said, if any of you are interested, they're looking for people to translate. So would you like to do this? And I said, sure, that will be great. And so I began with translating a couple books, and that's expanded to a few more. And also now serving as an editor. So I've finished my translations, Genesis, 1st, 2nd Samuel, 1st, 2nd Kings. And so I'm moving into the editorial phase of that and looking over other people's work that they've done. So those submissions are starting to come in.
So there's a whole conversation in regards to Hebrew pedagogy that connects with this. And that is, should we be teaching our students to be translators, like you are now officially, or should we be teaching our students to read the text? So, for instance, you know that I can pick up and I can read Spanish, but I can't tell you what the grammar means. I just know what it means in English. I know the translation in my head, but I can't tell you the grammatical rules as to that. Right. Now, having gone through being a Hebrew student to a Hebrew professor to now a Bible translator, do you see the pedagogy needing to be changed or pulled back, maybe away from translation to more just, okay, if you're not going to be a translator, maybe you should just be a reader of the text?
I think it's important to have reading skills, and I think it's also important to have translation skills for a few reasons. So let me take a second or two to explain what I mean by that. Our country here in the United States is more diverse than ever, multicultural. And so there are more languages represented than ever before. I think that just in general, we need to learn how to interact in multiple languages. And I think translating is very important because we need to learn what something means and then be able to translate that or explain that in many different languages. And, as many languages as we're able to work, based on our spheres. So I work in a Spanish context as well. And so translating is important in the sense of helping students in the class, but also knowing what this means and then explaining what this means in a Spanish concept as well. So I think translation is very important, tying that to hermeneutics and everything else for the meaning, so that people clearly understand what something says.
Yeah, I agree. I think
Yeah,
that we need everybody to be able to help bring the meaning across.
right.
But I tend to wonder if the historical method of teaching Hebrew with such grammar heavy methods
Yeah.
um, stunts people's retention rate.
I think you've got to make the carrots appear regularly
It's
and
good.
early.
That's good.
So what that means is, we have to do the grammar and everything else, but show what this means, and in the teaching on a regular basis and very early show, here's the takeaway, here's the value of this. And so
Yeah.
if we focus on the grammar and all of those things, as well as showing people this is why this is valuable and keeping them engaged instead of you just leaping through a hoop so you can get these credit hours, I think that's important. So put the cookies on a lower shelf to show them
Yeah.
what those cookies actually are.
Yeah. Dr. Griffin would always make the statement that Hebrew doesn't stick in people's minds because we haven't shown them why it should stick.
Exactly.
If we draw those aha moments out, it makes the learning process a little bit more enjoyable, I think.
I think so also. And, when we're really interested in something, I mean, we usually learn obscure facts about
Yeah.
that. We're very interested. And so if we can get people to buy in early and be engaged, I think that really
Yeah.
helps.
Yeah. This morning, for my quiet time, I was researching from Leviticus, the Azazel,
Right, right,
the second goat of the Passover, or not Passover, I'm sorry, of Day of Atonement.
right.
And I had always been told that it was a demon. And so I started reading and researching into there's actually a bunch of scrolls that spell it differently at different ways and times, and that changes the intention of what that word is. So yeah, it makes it really fun and interesting whenever you're like, okay, is that they're sacrificing one to God and one to a demon? Like what?
Yeah,
It scratches the mind and makes you go, okay, maybe I need to read the Hebrew of this text and figure
right.
out
Yeah,
what
what's
is
going
happening
on?
here.
Yeah, that's true. Right.
Yeah. So, what, in your opinion, is your favorite aha moment in learning Hebrew and revelation it brought to the biblical text for you?
I wrote my dissertation on the arm of the Lord,
Okay.
Zero Adonai, and I was amazed with the help of my advisor, Dr. Kilpatrick, how many of those references to the arm of the Lord actually are messianic. And so it was
Mm,
tying these together. And I don't think those connections are as easy to make if you're studying it in the English. And so
mm,
there's a very directed way that these arm of the Lord references work. And in Isaiah, it was just amazing. Just as you might roll up your sleeve to show your
mm-hmm,
arm, it says the Lord is going to bear his arm.
mm-hmm,
And it's a reference to how Jesus is going to be revealed as the Son of God. And
mm,
so this revelation, which was hidden in times past, God is going to roll up his sleeves and show exactly who this arm is and reveal his son. And so
mm,
it really added an extra depth to those passages,
mm-hmm,
and especially what Isaiah was saying, which is why when you study a lot of the rabbis, they're
mm-hmm.
making some very interesting observations that are very deep. And you think, that's interesting because that's actually what the New Testament says. But
Yeah.
how did they get there? How did they understand that? It's because they had a really good understanding of the Hebrew and how it all fits together.
Yeah. A book that I have on my to read list is Thanks to the Talmud, I'm Now a Messianic Jew.
Wow.
And that is one of the phrases that I saw in the footnotes that he walked through and said the rabbis are talking about this in a way that only Jesus fulfills.
Right. Rockmel Friedland did the same thing. So he wrote a
mm,
book, What the Rabbis Know About the Messiah, and
mhm,
he was studying to be a rabbi, and
mm,
he began to study these passages and said, "Well, this is amazing. Jesus must be the Messiah," and so
yeah,
he's doing that, studying the Hebrew. Yeah,
I'm putting that down.
I have that
I'll
in
add it
my
to my
office.
list.
Very helpful book. It's a short book and
Good.
very helpful.
Maybe I'll require it of my grad students in the spring that is doing a Jewish roots of the Christian faith course with me. So that could be a fun side read.
Yeah, I think they'd like it.
Well, so last question. What is your favorite passage to read in Hebrew and why?
That is difficult. I mean, because there's so many favorite passages. Maybe I can tell you one that I'm reading through now
It's what
and learn.
everybody has done so far.
I mean that's the thing about Hebrew. Whatever you're studying, you're like, hey, that's really
That's
awesome.
really good.
My favorite right now. Yeah. So
Yeah.
I've been working through Numbers 24,
Mm,
and it's the Balaam prophecies.
yeah.
And actually writing an article about how the New Testament uses the Old Testament, and looking specifically at Balaam's prophecy
Mm,
of who is to come that will be ruling over Israel. And so I've been really getting into that recently and studying that. And
mm,
it's really amazing because Balaam says, I see him, but not yet. He's not near. He's far off. He's going to do
mhm,
this. And then we actually see that passage in the New Testament. Revelation references it a couple of times in relation to
mm,
Jesus. The book of Matthew. In fact, I think, and this was an aha moment from last week, it's the reason why Herod was so worried when he heard that the wise men had come. They said,
mm,
we've been following his star because in Numbers it says a star will come from Jacob.
mhm.
One of the things that the star would do would be to destroy Edom, and Herod was an Idumean. So he
Yeah.
was descended
Yeah. He
from
wasn't Jewish by blood.
not Jewish by blood. And so he knew of that prophecy,
Mhm,
heard that this Messiah had been born. It frightened him because he was worried about personally what it would mean to him, which gives us some of the motivation of the extremes that he took to try to kill the Messiah. So
mm.
it's a really interesting passage.
Yeah. I'm gonna have to go look at that in the text.
Right. And it's amazing too, because Balaam is a false prophet.
Right.
You know that he's a false prophet because
But
he
he couldn't declare
encourages.
what he was paid to declare.
That's right. Yeah. So he actually fulfills one of the criteria of an Israelite prophet, that
Mm,
what you say comes true.
right.
And number two, if what you say comes true, if that happens, but you also tell people to worship false gods, then you're still a false prophet. And so he
Yeah.
encouraged the Israelites to sin. And so in the end, he's a false prophet, but
Yeah.
God overrides all of that to give a message to Moab.
Yeah. I was preaching this past Sunday on Ezekiel 13 and the false prophets in that text. Really interesting, very similar parallels to Balaam. So I'm
Hmm.
gonna have to go think on that, and how some of them were declaring good things, but they were still leading the Israelites astray.
Right.
Yeah,
That's true.
interesting. Well, what is your one, if you had one, what is your one recommendation to students to retain their Hebrew?
Repetition.
Mm,
And it's kind of old school, but something that worked for me that was recommended to me is to get a dry erase board, a portable dry erase board, and then over and over again, just to practice writing and
mm,
to practice writing words. And
mhm,
that's what I would recommend, because the more senses that we employ, if we're writing, if we're reading, if we're pronouncing, the more
mhm.
senses we can use, the easier it is to grab onto a language.
Yeah, that's really good.
Yeah.
I appreciate it. Well, thanks so much for the fun chat. And well, you and I will be together in a few months at ETS Nationals. But for everybody else that came and listened to this, I hope you enjoyed it. And if you go to Memphis, look up Dr. Akers and Mid American Baptist Theological Seminary. I studied there and it's good fun. So thanks for this episode, everybody. Bye now.